a ladder that hopefully you can climb into this pool. These are things that are not necessarily part of the statement of faith, not necessarily part of the core dogma, not necessarily part of those things, but they support those things and they lead us to say that we think the rest of this stuff is verifiable. Here are a couple things I'm just going to go through. There are no blanks to fill out. There are no things on the screen. You're just going to have to take your own notes. But the first question is the text of the Bible accurate? Someone might say, we can't trust the text of the Bible because have you ever played the game of telephone? You know, if this is passed on to this person, then this is passed on to this person, this is passed on to this person, and it's passed on to this person, you might start out with the cat's in the bag, and you might end up with the bat looks like a hag. And it's like, how did we get there? You know, you've played the game before, I know, and people use that to say we can't trust the Bible because it's a copy of 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 a copy, right? You've probably heard that before if you've ever had this conversation with someone. So how do we know it's reliable? Well, let me say a couple things first about the telephone game, because I've played it. I know a little bit of how it works. The telephone game only works in some situations. Have you ever noticed whenever you're playing the telephone game, everybody's standing in a line? What does that mean? It means I have to whisper to the next person because I don't want the third person to hear. So I'm whispering to the second person. I'm not speaking clearly. I'm not speaking really loudly. I'm not really communicating. If we did the telephone game differently, where I stood in this room and there was only one person in this room and that person was in there and I said, the cat's in the bag. And then the next person came into the room and they said, the cat's, it would go all the way through like 100 people if it were clearly communicated like that. The only reason the telephone game works is because we're whispering and it's quiet. Another reason it works is that the phrases we say are unimportant. We say stupid phrases so that we end up with a stupid phrase at the other end. They're unimportant. Now, if instead I said, Obama is the president, which is a far more significant phrase than the cat's in the bag, Obama is the president, well, people are going to remember that more easily, and it's going to get communicated better. Another way that the telephone game doesn't work is that the people who are in that game are not practiced at it. You never play the telephone game with full-grown adults with great hearing. You always play the telephone game with junior hires. I mean, come on, because that's where it's the most fun. That's where you get all these crazy little ideas thrown in, you know. And the other thing is, the telephone game never happens in the context of community. It's always one person to one person to one person to one person. I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. How would the telephone game work if at the beginning of the line, now we all know that you have to keep the phrases relatively short for us to remember them, right? But what if the telephone game began with me saying to the first person, Mary had a little lamb. Her fleece was white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go. Maybe that phrase would get a little farther. Or, twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. That phrase would go farther. Why? Because it's part of our community conscience. Most of us in this room have heard those poems, those songs before. Most of us in this room are familiar with those things. And so we hear someone say that, and it's just a no-brainer. We reconstruct it. Or what if it happened so that every single time someone was wrong, the next person could say, wait a minute, I've heard that poem before. That one's not right. If you get a community involved, then the communication from one person to another person is internally consistent. Am I making sense? So I can say the very same thing about the Bible. The Bible is an important message surrounded by a community of people who were convinced that it was true, convinced that it was important, and it was communicated in a context of people who were highly practiced at that kind of communication. In an oral language culture where things are passed on verbally, you had to memorize what people said, and they were well practiced at it. They could do that. The ancient rabbis had the entire Old Testament memorized, some of them. In fact, you weren't allowed to be a rabbi if you did not have Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers memorized by heart. You could quote any part of it. That was how the rabbis became rabbis. Okay, so is the text of the Bible accurate? I'll say this, and this will sort of close the book on that question, hopefully. The text of the Bible is more verifiably accurate from archaeological research than any other ancient document of any sort in any culture globally. The New Testament has something like 5,000 manuscript pieces and copies that we can use to reconstruct the original with 99% accuracy. The closest ancient document to the New Testament is Homer's Iliad with about 900 copies. So that means the Bible, the New Testament at least, surpasses Homer's Iliad by 5-6 times the number of documents we have that are really ancient. The Old Testament doesn't have as many raw documents like that, little bits and pieces, but we have lots of full editions of the Old Testament because the ancient Hebrews were extraordinarily uptight about their text. They preserved it to the point where when the scribes were translating a page, they would then take a line and they would draw an X on the page. And if the X in the middle, if the X did not fall on the same exact letter, they would throw out the whole page and they would start over again. If there was one tiny spelling mistake, it was allowed. But if there were 3 on a page, they had to throw it out. And if there was a letter, if the letter in the middle was wrong, if the number of letters on the page were wrong, they'd throw out the whole thing. So is the text of the Bible accurate? More accurate than any other ancient document. Okay? The second question, though, is the teaching of the Bible trustworthy? I mean, can we trust what it says? Well, the best way to think about that, you've probably heard people say something like, there are many contradictions in the Bible, and so because there's so many contradictions, I can't pay attention to it, or I won't pay attention to it. The truth of the matter is there aren't any substantial contradictions. The contradictions you find in the Bible are things like this. Jesus heals one blind man. One blind man comes up to Jesus and he heals that blind man. And then in another gospel it says 2 blind men came up to Jesus and he healed 2 blind men. So there's a contradiction. This one says there was 1 blind man. This one says there are 2 blind men. The problem is, if 2 blind men come up to Jesus, there had to be 1 blind man. So that means this one is right because there was a blind man who came up. Or maybe it's 2 different stories. Okay, so there are no hard and fast contradictions in the Bible that can be demonstrated. They're all sort of incidental like that. But more important than that, let me share with you 3 things. Okay, jot these things down if you want. First of all, on every testable claim, Luke says something happened in a particular city. Paul says something happened in a particular city with a particular governor. On every testable claim, archaeology has substantiated the claims of the Bible time and time again. Okay? So on anything that's testable, the Bible comes out reliable. Beyond that, there are some things in the Old Testament that prophesy things that happen in the New Testament. And there are some things in the New Testament that prophesy things that are going to happen later. Jesus, a long time before it happened, said that the temple in Jerusalem was going to fall, was going to be destroyed. And then much later, in 69 AD, the temple actually was destroyed. It did fall. And Jesus was clearly crucified by the Romans back in 33-ish, sometime around then. And so if he said those words, there's no way he could have prophesied that unless he had some type of supernatural insight. Okay? So here's the thing. The prophetic claims let us know that the Bible is supernatural. The testable claims let us know it's reliable. The prophetic claims let us know it's supernatural. One more thing. Jesus and the apostles together teach that the whole Bible is a unified thing. It's all together. It's total. It all teaches one thing. Okay, those are your 3 things about trustworthy. Okay, now, I'm going to give you my ultimate argument for why I get into the circle, why I jump into the pool, okay? And it's this 3rd one here. I've printed all them down there, so I just need you to look at them. This is the kind of thing that hopefully you can get into your heart so that when someone brings up those questions about why do you trust the Bible, you've got this, okay? And is the Bible really authoritative? Here are a couple things. First of all, the New Testament is a historically reliable account of the life and teaching of Jesus. There's been some debate, but time and time again, there are many different ways of proving that the New Testament account is the best account for understanding who Jesus was, what he said, and what his life meant. Okay? The New Testament is historically reliable. Number 2, Jesus taught, and we know that his teaching is historically reliable because the New Testament has been proven so. Jesus taught that the Old Testament was perfectly and eternally accurate. Okay, so Jesus is making a spiritual claim. You can believe it or not. You can choose to believe it, or you can choose to not believe it. How do we determine that? Well, let's look at one more thing Jesus said. Jesus also taught that the whole Old Testament pointed to him. Okay, so Jesus claims that the whole Old Testament is accurate. He claims that the whole Old Testament points to him. Why should we believe Jesus? The next thing on the list. Jesus rose from the dead. As far as I'm concerned, if you want to beat Jesus, you got to let me kill you, and then you got to come back in less than 3 days. Because, that would beat him. You got to be faster, right? So Jesus rose from the dead. Okay, so this is key. The New Testament is historically accurate. The claim that Jesus rose from the dead is a historical claim. If those two things are true, then we should believe what Jesus said in between. All right? One more. Jesus gave the apostles authority to teach in his name. And then number 6, the New Testament is written with apostolic authority. Okay, so let me summarize what we're saying so far. I want you to jump in the pool. The Bible tells us some things about itself. And that's a circular argument unless you have convinced yourself that you're going to get into this pool and you're going to experience this thing and you're going to learn these things and you're going to let the Bible continue to teach you about itself. But in order to get into that pool, some of you need that extra little oomph. And I believe that this argument here, this step-by-step approach says, okay, the Bible's accurate. Jesus says it's supernatural. Jesus came back from the dead, and Jesus' whole apostles and himself teach that it's all unified. So therefore, the Old Testament and the New Testament have to have come from God. You see where I'm coming from there? Okay. Once you get there, now our statement makes sense. Now we can start to learn at what the Bible has to say for itself. If you're not a Christian today, then you're probably not going to believe these things about the Bible. That's all right. You can just text a question to me and we'll deal with that. If you are a Christian, what we're about to say here, this is what you say you believe. And if the stuff we talk about today is not what you say you believe, then you have to stop calling yourself a Christian. Okay? Because this is what Jesus teaches about the Bible. This is what the Bible teaches about itself. And it's something that we have to say is good enough to be dogma. Okay? Authoritative for me. Okay, let's go. Let's dig into it. The first phrase is the Bible is the Word of God. Check out this verse. 2 Timothy 3:16-17 says, all Scripture is God-breathed and is useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness, so that the man of God may be thoroughly equipped for every good work. 2 Timothy 3:16-17. This is my favorite passage on the Bible itself. Because that word there, God-breathed, is a word Paul invented. I love this. Paul invents this word when he's writing a letter to Timothy because he's trying to express